Welcome back, Econ students. This will be maybe the last lecture here. I'm not sure. You guys have had a lot of lectures recently on the presidency, the executive branch, the White House staff. So we're going to get going today with another lecture that's going to look at the idea of presidential reform and what goes into the reform engine. So you guys can, let me see. Oh, I know I want to go this way. I want to pop out, and you can see that nice engine there, jet engine. And we're going to look at this idea of presidential reform today in this lecture. So get ready, take some good notes, and again, please jot down any questions that you might have for me in class. And here we go. Presidential reform, what goes into the reform engine? Well, as you know, the demands on the presidency have grown substantially in the 20th century, and there seems to be no signs of them letting up. And at the same time the demands are increasing, the effectiveness of presidential leadership is coming into question. The shortcomings of presidential leadership are placed before the American people on a daily basis by the news media that reports relentlessly on these topics. And so rare are the moments when presidents are applauded for their leadership, when there are good feelings and support for a president, and those moments, if they do come, are fleeting at best. So presidents are really kind of stuck where the public, you see this gentleman banging on a desk with his fist. We just have these great demands, sometimes unrealistic demands. So there's been some talk about reforming the presidency as these questions about presidential leadership and effectiveness have come up. And I think Americans become frustrated with each new president and how each new president comes into office and really tries to turn campaign ideas and campaign promises into policy and ultimately into law. And so how do presidents get elected? That's something we're going to look at. Presidents campaign around the country, meeting as many people as they can, appearing on TV stations in debates, etc. And they have to outline their ideas, and they inevitably make promises that if elected, they will do this, this, and this, and that's just becoming more and more difficult. Partisan gridlock, the economic times, outside events in the greater world, the dynamic world, economy, all sorts of reasons have come together to sort of conspire against effective presidential leadership. So the idea is reform, and that's what we're going to look at in this lecture. What reforms to the presidency can be undertaken, and how pressing is the need for the reform of the presidency. So let's move forward, and we'll take a look at the idea of shared powers. And I think one thing that presidents themselves need to realize, and those maybe running for the office, is that presidents are one part of a political system that shares powers and places legal limits on their actions. And you can see in this very simple drawing schematic that we have a system of checks and balances that really divides or shares power among the three branches. And we know that in the 20th century, in particular, the uppity presidents have been trying to increase their powers, and that really upsets the balance. That upsets the apple cart, if you will. And so that needs to be addressed, and presidents themselves need to address that. We can look, for example, to the actions of President Bush and his vice president, Dick Cheney, and they're illustrative of the uppity president. President Bush believed and behaved as though the office of the president had few limits in both domestic policy making and in international war. And in particular, with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, President Bush argued that war times are special times that allow presidents to have greater powers, that there is no limitation, or there are fewer limitations on his power. So I'm back. There was a brief interruption. So war times are special times that present challenges, and President Bush argued that his power could not be limited, or that he had more power. So we see this with the ongoing war on terror. So when does this war end in the current situation? When can we claim victory over terror and the terrorists that want to damage the United States, hurt the United States? And if we can't claim or proclaim an end to the war, then the state of war is permanent. And if the state of war is permanent, does that mean that, as Bush argued, the president's powers are enhanced and he has greater authority on a permanent basis? So these are all very challenging questions, very difficult questions that need to be addressed, but presidents themselves might in fact recognize the idea of shared powers. It's something that the founding fathers cherished. It's in the text of the Constitution, which at times, yes, is vague, but I do believe we can clearly see the intent of the framers of the Constitution to create this system of checks and balance. So let's move on to the second thing, and this really gets at these things called signing statements. And the idea is, and you can see President Bush seated in the Oval Office signing a bill and then possibly writing or issuing a signing statement. Now, we haven't really encountered signing statements, and I don't think many people know what they truly are. And throughout most of American history, signing statements were innocuous. Presidents used signing statements to remark on the importance of a new law or to call for more related legislation. So it was really a presidential statement about a law that he had just signed. So there's nothing really to be concerned about, right? Well, President George W. Bush, again, 2001 to 2009, wrote or issued more signing statements than all previous presidents. And here's what he began to do. He used the signing statement to identify parts or sections, so parts or sections of laws that he believed intruded on presidential powers and prerogatives. And more importantly, President Bush declared that he would not be bound by the sections of laws that he identified as troublesome and as limiting his power. So we already discussed in the previous slide that President Bush saw himself as a wartime president with enhanced or increased authority and power. Now he used these signing statements to say, well, I'm not sure I like that part of that law, therefore it doesn't apply to me. So that to me seems to be troublesome. Traditionally and constitutionally, when presidents disagreed with laws, they vetoed them, and Congress could either override the veto or amend the law. So this seems to be a dangerous development, in my opinion. So how many of you or your parents knew about signing statements before this lecture? Ask them. Stop the lecture. See what they have to say about this. So let's move on as quickly as we can. Presidents and war. Now, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this because you have already discussed, read, and written about this topic of war. And in specific, we've discussed the 1973 War Powers Resolution. And as you know, the Constitution grants power to declare war to the Congress. And Congress represents the people in both the House and the Senate. And we know that the last time Congress declared war was in 1941, after Pearl Harbor. But after World War II ended in 1945, because of the fight against communism around the globe, or the fight against terrorists around the globe, Congress has been all too willing to give presidents a blank check when it comes to war, with the exception of the 1973 War Powers Resolution that presidents tend to disregard or say that it really doesn't apply to them, and that the demands placed on them in terms of the war on terror are such that you just can't get to Congress in some instances to get their opinion, to have that full debate and discussion. So we have already talked about the presidents and war, and again, do we need to reform that? Do we need to restore balance by having Congress exercise its authority? I think I've already stated my opinion, which is yes. Let's move on to this. There are concerns about the White House staff, the Vice President, and the Cabinet itself. Of late, vice presidents have exercised more influence, which creates confusion. Who's really in charge? The White House staff, and in particular the Chief of Staff, have been empowered to help presidents respond to the great challenges of the modern world, and there are many. Yet, our Chiefs of Staff, always honest brokers, honest facilitators, and process managers who represent the interests of the American people. Were they elected? No, they were not elected to the position of Chief of Staff. They were appointed by the President. And remember that the President appoints people that typically helped him win election to the presidency and who are loyal to the President. So there are many who feel like the Chief of Staff in particular, but the White House staff in general, are too caught up in loyalty to the President and partisan politics. That is, playing your party's agenda above possibly the interests of the American people. So the question then, what happens when a president's interests and goals do not align and do not reflect the public's interests? If the staff that surrounds the president and works with him, and you see this in that picture there, Who are these guys? Who elected them? What happens when the interests of the president do not align with the public interest? So these are all areas of great concern to scholars and to journalists who spend their days studying, writing, and reporting about our national political system in Washington, D.C., and in particular the presidency. As I've said before, all eyes are on the president. The president has daily press briefings and conferences. Wherever the president goes, there's an awful lot of attention focused on the president. So, you know, that in itself may be an issue and or a problem. So, to end this lecture, and we're at just about 10.5 minutes, so we'll come up to about 11 minutes. Now that we have studied the Congress and the presidency, what are your thoughts about the cherished concept of separation and balance of powers? Is our system still balanced in the 21st century? Would the founders be happy with what they see today? Or do we need to think about enacting reforms, especially of the presidency, to deal with some of the areas we touched upon in this lecture? What are your thoughts? And again, I'd like you to now stop the lecture. This concludes this lecture, but I'd like you to jot down your thoughts. And again, it's always, I think, a great idea to have a discussion with mom, dad, and to see what they think. To have that discussion, whether it be at the dinner table or in the car on the way somewhere, to touch base with them, to see what their thoughts are. So thank you very much. I look forward to hearing your thoughts in class, and please bring any questions with you. Thanks.